Hello everyone. Tonight we are going to dive into something incredibly strange, painful, and oddly poetic. The justice system of the Aztec Empire. You probably think of pyramids, precise calendars, and a fair bit of human sacrifice when you hear Aztec, and you're not wrong. But they didn't just sacrifice people for religious reasons. They also had a legal system, one filled with punishments as creative as they were terrifying. You might imagine being dragged naked through the city, with chili powder rubbed into your wounds for stealing food, or being forced to inhale smoke until you passed out just for cutting down the wrong tree. These weren't acts of madness. This was Aztec law, where punishment was both performance and policy. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I'm doing here. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, turn off the lights, maybe turn on the fan, and play some soft background music, and let's get started tonight. This section introduces the Aztec legal system, highlighting its surprising organization despite its brutality. The written code of laws, known as the Huheti, the role of judges, including appeals, and the public, theatrical nature of punishments, emphasizing how social class influenced sentencing. When people think of the Aztec Empire, often the first images that come to mind are heart sacrifices, blood-soaked pyramids, and priests wielding obsidian knives. Not exactly a civilization known for its warm approach to human resources, right? But here's the thing. The Aztecs didn't just swing blades at anyone who annoyed them. They had a legal system, and it was surprisingly organized, sophisticated even. Brutal? Absolutely. Chaotic? Number. Aztec justice had rules, codes, and a structure that would make your HOA jealous. Laws were written into a code known as the Huheti, a set of wise sayings and instructions that covered everything from marriage and market conduct to how not to die painfully in public. These laws were passed down through generations, and while there weren't any leather-bound law books, there were judges, actual specialized officials, who took their jobs very seriously. No powdered wigs, just stern faces, and an excellent memory for punishment options. And yes, they even had appeals courts. You could argue your case to hire judges, though your chances were slim if the community already saw you as that guy who stole the corn twice. Judges were often priests or elder nobles, people considered wise, experienced, and highly trained in the legal traditions. They weren't above taking bribes, sure, but if you were caught bribing them, you could be executed. So really, everyone played the game carefully. What made Aztec justice truly unique was its mix of morality and pageantry. Justice wasn't just served, it was performed. Punishments were designed to teach lessons, not quietly behind closed doors, but loudly, publicly, and often with props. You didn't just pay a fine for a crime. You were shaved, painted, dragged, or symbolically transformed into a warning poster with legs. And here's the most Aztec part. Some punishments changed depending on your social class. Nobles were held to higher standards and harsher punishments. A commoner might be fined or flogged. A noble who did the same thing could lose land, titles, or his head. So no, Aztec justice wasn't random. It was sharp, stylish, public, and a little theatrical. And if you broke the law, the empire made sure you never forgot it, and neither did your neighbors. Historians still debate whether this public display truly reduced crime rates or simply created a society built on fear. but it certainly ensured everyone knew the rules. The Aztec court, swift justice, no jails. This section details the Aztec court system, emphasizing its public nature, the roles of judges, the lack of lawyers and jails, and the speed at which judgments and punishments were delivered, often on the same day as the trial. So, you've broken a law in the Aztec Empire. Maybe you drank pulque underage. Maybe you stole a basket of maize. Or maybe, and let's hope not, you cut down a sacred tree. Whatever your crime, you're about to meet the Aztec court system. Don't bother calling your lawyer. There aren't any. The Aztec courts were highly structured, but not exactly what you'd call cozy. Think more stone platforms surrounded by stern men in feathered cloaks than cozy courtroom drama. The trial would take place publicly, often in a plaza or temple court, and it wasn't designed for theatrics, unless you count the part where someone might be shaved, painted, or whipped in front of a crowd. Cases were typically heard by judges known as tlaxitlan, wise elders or noblemen, trained in the laws and customs of the empire. They weren't just randomly assigned. They had to study for years, memorize large sections of law code, and learn how to spot a liar from 10 paces away. You didn't argue with them, unless you really liked the sound of public flogging. The accused could defend themselves, and sometimes a family member or elder might speak on their behalf. But let's be honest, unless you were incredibly persuasive or very, very lucky, things probably weren't leaning in your favor. There were witnesses, evidence, and even multiple courts, including a high court and an emperor-level appeal. Yes, you could take your case all the way to the top, but the journey there was rough, and if the emperor decided you were guilty, well, let's just say there wouldn't be much paperwork afterward. One thing you'll notice quickly: the Aztecs didn't believe in dragging things out. No long trials, no years of debate. Judgments came fast, and punishment often came the same day. That's efficiency. Terrifying, skin-peeling efficiency. Also, no jails. Aztec society didn't warehouse criminals. You were either fined, humiliated, enslaved, or executed, and sometimes all four. But you were never forgotten. Aztec courts weren't about legal rights or clever technicalities. They were about moral clarity, social order, and public spectacle. So, if you're standing before an Aztec judge, straighten up, speak carefully, and try not to sweat too obviously. They notice that sort of thing. Historians still debate whether this rapid-fire justice system was more effective than modern, slower approaches in deterring crime, but it certainly kept things moving. The chilly smoke chamber. Discipline for disobedient children. This section focuses on the unique Aztec punishment for misbehaving children. The chilly smoke chamber, detailing its methods, the intent behind it, shame-based conditioning rather than physical harm, and other forms of child discipline, emphasizing the importance of obedience in Aztec society. In most cultures, kids who misbehave get a timeout, or maybe a stern lecture. In the Aztec Empire, they got something a little more intense. Meet the chilly smoke chamber, possibly history's most dramatic method of saying, "Listen to your mother." In Aztec households, obedience wasn't optional. Children were expected to work, listen, respect their elders, and contribute to the home. The idea was simple: train them early to be good citizens, hard workers, and future warriors or weavers. And if little Cuauhtemoc didn't want to sweep the floor or dared to talk back, he got the chili. The punishment was called tlaxitlan, and it involved placing the disobedient child in a small enclosed space such as a hut or storage room where chilies had been thrown onto a fire. As they burned, the room filled with a smoke so intense it made your eyes burn, your throat close up, and your sinuses scream. Think pepper spray, but with spiritual intent. The child wasn't harmed physically, at least not permanently, but the experience was unforgettable. They weren't beaten, bruised, or bloodied. Instead, they were overwhelmed. The sensory overload of chili vapor did the job of several hours of parental yelling in just a few minutes. And the goal wasn't cruelty, it was shame-based conditioning. Once you've coughed up your will to misbehave, you're unlikely to sass your parents again, at least until your voice comes back. Other punishments for children included being pricked with cactus spines, forced to sweep temples in public, or made to carry bundles of firewood beyond their strength. These acts weren't about humiliation for fun. They were rites of correction. And in a society where every person had a social duty, discipline wasn't negotiable. Even noble children weren't spared. In fact, they were held to higher standards. A noble boy who disrespected a teacher or elder could be bound, beaten, or even temporarily enslaved, not permanently, but enough to make the lesson sting, figuratively and literally. So, if you grew up Aztec, rebellion came with real consequences, and probably a few tearful, fiery afternoons spent marinating in chili smoke. Spicy? Yes. Effective? Definitely. And let's face it, no one forgets their first chili sauna. Historians still debate the long-term psychological effects of such severe disciplinary measures, but for the Aztecs, order began at home. This section delves into the Aztec Empire's severe penalties for theft, ranging from reparations for first-time offenders to enslavement for repeat offenses, culminating in ritual skinning for a third offense, highlighting the symbolic and public nature of these gruesome punishments. The Aztec Empire had one of the most unforgiving views of theft in the ancient world. Stealing wasn't just a moral failing, it was an attack on the structure of society. Food, tools, cloth, firewood, it all had value, and taking what wasn't yours didn't just offend your neighbor, it offended the gods. And the punishment? Let's just say, the Aztecs weren't into subtlety. For first-time offenders, things started reasonably. A thief might be forced to return the stolen goods, make reparations, or be publicly shamed. Maybe a few lashes, maybe a haircut that said, "I steal things." Painful, but survivable. But if you stole again, you entered the realm of enslavement. The Aztecs didn't do prisons. They preferred that you work off your debt, quite literally. Caught a second time, and you might be handed over to the victim as a personal servant. You'd labor in silence, dignity gone, every step reminding you that honesty would have been easier. Now, if you were bold or foolish enough to steal a third time, things turned gruesome. Punishment 3 was often ritual skinning. Not quick, not clean, and absolutely not private. It was slow, ceremonial, and publicly displayed. This wasn't just about pain, it was about symbolism. The skin was considered a sacred layer, a part of your identity. To remove it was to unmake you in the eyes of the community. Sometimes the skin was removed in strips, other times whole, and it wasn't just thrown away. In religious ceremonies, a priest might even wear the skin for a brief time in honor of the earth goddess, representing rebirth and punishment, all in one macabre package. Sound horrifying? It was, and that was the point. This kind of justice wasn't just about the individual, it was about the message. A skinned thief in the market square stopped 1,000 future crimes. It made you think twice before swiping tamales or slipping a jade bead into your tunic. The Aztecs believed in law, in consequence, and in the power of example, and their message was clear. Steal once, we'll warn you. Steal twice, we'll work you. Steal 3 times, you won't be needing your skin. Historians still debate the effectiveness of such extreme deterrence in a pre-literate society. Did the horror truly prevent crime, or did it just create an atmosphere of terror? Adultery, death by blunt force. This section examines the Aztec Empire's severe penalties for adultery, treated as a capital crime punishable by death, often by bludgeoning. It covers who could accuse, the methods of execution for both men and women, the stricter standards for nobles, and the severe consequences for false accusations. In the Aztec Empire, marriage was serious business, not just a social contract, but a sacred bond tied to cosmic balance, family honor, and economic alliances. So, when someone broke that bond with a little romantic extracurricular activity, the punishment was not divorce court. It was death by blunt object. Let's begin with the basics. Adultery wasn't treated as a private scandal. It was a capital crime, publicly prosecuted and severely punished. And it wasn't just men who got to point fingers. Women could accuse too. But if you were caught, the empire didn't do therapy. If a man was found sleeping with another man's wife, the husband had options, and none of them involved second chances. The most common penalty? Public execution, often by bludgeoning with a stone club, a heavy instrument, sometimes a macuawit, a sword-like weapon embedded with obsidian blades. But for domestic dishonor, the blunt version got the job done painfully and thoroughly. Sometimes, the punishment wasn't left to the courts. In certain cases, the wronged spouse could carry out the sentence, personally talk about closure. Women caught cheating faced equally grim fates: death by strangulation, stoning, or being thrown off a cliff were all on the table, depending on the region and the exact nature of the betrayal. Nobles, of course, were held to stricter standards, because when the wealthy cheat, it's not just scandal, it's potential dynastic collapse. And let's not forget the drama. If the affair was exposed publicly, the accused might be paraded through the streets, mocked, shaved, painted, all before meeting their final punishment. Shame was not a side effect, it was part of the sentence. Now, if someone accused you falsely, that was another story. Lying about adultery could get you executed as well. The Aztecs didn't tolerate character assassination unless it came with evidence, and they took witness testimony seriously. So, no rumor mongering for revenge, unless you liked playing with obsidian. At the heart of it all, Aztec marriage was a sacred institution, and violating it wasn't just a moral slip. It was an insult to society, gods, and law. So, if you ever wondered whether ancient civilizations cared about monogamy, in the Aztec Empire, the answer was yes to death. Historians still debate whether these harsh laws truly enforced moral purity or simply reflected a society's deep-seated anxieties about lineage and property. Sacred trees. When vandalism becomes a spiritual offense. This section explores the severe consequences for cutting down sacred trees in the Aztec Empire. It explains that such acts were considered spiritual offenses, not just vandalism, leading to punishments like public beatings, restitution, confiscation of property, and even enslavement, highlighting the deep connection between nature and the divine in Aztec culture. You've heard of being punished for theft, murder, even adultery. But what about cutting down the wrong tree in the Aztec Empire? Some trees weren't just wood with leaves, they were sacred. They represented the gods, the ancestors, or the very balance of nature. And if you, in your infinite wisdom, decided to chop one down for firewood, well, say goodbye to your house, possibly your dignity too. Certain trees, especially those planted near temples, marketplaces, or shrines, were considered protected by divine right. Damaging one was seen as a spiritual offense, not just an act of vandalism. You weren't just hurting nature, you were insulting the cosmic order. The punishment for a first offense? You might be publicly beaten, often with cactus spines or thorny branches. Yes, they made nature punish you with itself. Poetic justice with a prickly edge. But that wasn't the worst of it. In many cases, you'd also be forced to pay restitution in the form of goods, labor, or even losing your home. Your property could be confiscated or burned, and in some regions, the offending tree cutter was paraded through the town while villagers hurled insults and occasionally pebbles. The idea wasn't just to hurt you physically, it was to let everyone know this idiot messed with the gods' landscaping. And if you were a repeat offender, you might be enslaved, especially if the tree you harmed was near a sacred site. Because, apparently, if you couldn't respect the roots of a tree, you didn't deserve roots of your own. To modern ears, it might sound absurd, punished for trimming a branch. But to the Aztecs, this was serious. Nature wasn't passive, it was alive, sacred, and deeply connected to the divine. Trees, rivers, mountains, they weren't resources, they were relatives, and harming them without permission was like slapping your grandmother and hoping nobody noticed. So yes, if you lived in the Aztec Empire, you needed to know your botany laws. That tree outside your neighbor's house? Better ask first. The shady one in the marketplace? Definitely don't touch it. Because in this world, ignorance isn't bliss. It's just flammable property and bruises from thorns. Historians still debate the extent to which these laws were truly about ecological preservation versus maintaining social and religious control. But the consequences were undeniably real. Underage drinking, a capital offense. This section details the severe punishment for underage drinking in the Aztec Empire, where consuming pulque as a teenager was a capital crime. It describes the cultural significance of pulque, the swift and harsh penalties for young offenders, shaming, public display, execution, and the rationale behind such strict laws. In most cultures, teenage drinking ends with a lecture, a bad hangover, or a very awkward ride home with your parents. In the Aztec Empire, it ended with execution. Let's get one thing straight. The Aztecs weren't anti-alcohol. They had a beloved, sacred drink called pulque, made from the fermented sap of the magi plant. It was frothy, slightly sour, and loaded with ritual significance. Pulque was used in religious ceremonies, festivals, and even funeral rites. For adults, especially elders and priests, it was considered medicinal and divine. But if you were a teenager, one sip was a death sentence. Young Aztecs were expected to be disciplined, respectful, and absolutely sober. Pulque was for those who had earned it through battle, age, or wisdom. Youth was a time for learning, not partying, and drunkenness among teens wasn't just frowned upon, it was seen as moral collapse. So, if a teenager was caught drinking, The punishment was swift and harsh. A first-time offender might be shaved bald, a mark of shame. Sometimes they were paraded naked through the streets, while villagers hurled insults or trash, a mobile reminder that good choices are better than fermented ones. But for repeat offenders, the sentence escalated fast. Execution by strangulation or beating, often in public. The method wasn't designed for drama, it was designed for memory. One teenager, hanging from a pole, was all it took to sober up the rest of the neighborhood for a generation. Even noble-born youth weren't spared. In fact, they were held to stricter standards. A prince caught drinking might face ritual humiliation in the royal court, or be sent to live in a cold, remote temple as punishment. The message: privilege doesn't excuse foolishness. Why so severe? Because the Aztecs saw drunkenness as a kind of spiritual rot, a gateway to laziness, disrespect, and disobedience. And in a civilization that depended on order, discipline, and cosmic balance, a tipsy teen was a ticking time bomb. So, next time you imagine a wild Aztec party, remember, unless you were old, high-ranking, or involved in a funeral, your pulque cup stayed dry. Otherwise, your throat wouldn't. Historians still debate whether these strict laws were truly effective in preventing youth delinquency, or if they simply pushed such activities further underground. This section explains how laziness was considered a serious offense in the Aztec Empire, seen as an affront to the gods and a disruption of social harmony. It describes the punishments for idleness, ranging from public shaming and forced labor to temporary enslavement, and emphasizes that even nobles faced consequences for neglecting their duties. In the Aztec Empire, work wasn't just a chore, it was a virtue, a sacred expectation, a civic duty written into the social fabric. Everyone, from commoner to noble, had a role to play in the great cosmic machine. So what happened if you didn't pull your weight? Let's put it this way: you'd be working again very soon, just not by choice. Laziness, idleness, slacking off, these weren't treated as personality quirks. They were considered offenses against the gods, particularly Tlaloc, god of rain and agriculture, and Tezcatlipoca, who kept a sharp eye on moral behavior. The gods didn't give you good harvests so you could nap in the shade. If you disrespected the order of labor, the Aztecs made sure you'd feel the consequences. If a man refused to work, refused to help his family, or consistently ignored his civic duties, he could be dragged into the marketplace and publicly shamed. His head might be shaved, his clothes replaced with rags. In some cases, he'd be forced to wear rotten garments or carry bundles of firewood through the town while people shouted things like, "Behold, the man who does nothing." But that was the gentle version. Repeat offenders might be beaten with rods, tied to a post, or if their laziness was seen as willful defiance, sold into slavery, not forever, but long enough to learn the lesson. You're either useful or you're used. Even noble-born youths were monitored closely. If a young man of high rank refused to train for war or skipped temple duties, his family could request that he be sent to a house of youth correction, which sounds like summer camp but was really more like a military boot camp with cactus punishments. Laziness among women wasn't ignored either, though women had different duties: grinding maize, weaving, tending the home. They too could be shamed for neglect. Mothers were expected to raise hard-working children, not ones who lounged around chewing maize husks. The Aztec belief was simple: idleness disrupts harmony. A lazy person risks their family's well-being, their community's balance, and the favor of the gods. So if you were planning to lounge around the chinampa and skip your corn harvesting chores, better start running, because the punishment wouldn't be quiet and it wouldn't be optional. Historians still debate whether this strong work ethic was a result of the harsh environment or a core ideological belief. Market misconduct, dishonesty as betrayal. This section focuses on the strict laws governing marketplace conduct in the Aztec Empire, where dishonesty was considered a betrayal of the gods and community trust. It details punishments for selling spoiled or falsely advertised goods, ranging from public shaming and banishment to enslavement, branding, or even execution, underscoring the vital importance of fair trade. In the bustling heart of the Aztec Empire, the tranquil, or marketplace, everything was negotiable except honesty. Selling rotten fruit, watered-down pulque, or fake obsidian was not just bad business. It was criminal behavior, and the Aztecs had zero tolerance for marketplace mischief. You weren't just breaking a rule, you were betraying the gods who blessed commerce, agriculture, and fair exchange. Every seller, whether hawking tamales or trading jade, was expected to abide by strict ethical codes. Markets were sacred spaces, often overseen by special officials called poetic, market judges, or inspectors. Their job: walk among the stalls, listen for complaints, and catch people slipping pebbles into their chili powder. If you got caught selling spoiled goods, punishment was swift and very public. A first-time offense might involve public shaming, your stall overturned, your produce scattered, and your hands bound for everyone to see. Shoppers would walk past and spit insults like, "There goes the liar with wormy avocados." Selling something falsely advertised, say, dyed feathers labeled as sacred quetzal plumes, was even worse. That could get you beaten, fined, or in extreme cases, banished from the market altogether. And in a society where markets were your lifeline, banishment wasn't a timeout. It was economic death. Repeat offenders could be enslaved or branded, marked so future buyers knew never to trust your mangoes again. If your fraud caused real harm, like selling toxic herbs as medicine, you might even face execution, especially if the victim was of noble status. It wasn't just about punishment, it was about protecting trust. The market was where communities met, families survived, and tribute flowed. If buyers stopped trusting sellers, the entire structure began to crumble that couldn't be allowed. Even sellers of sacred goods, incense, ceremonial textiles, or idols were watched closely. If a temple merchant was caught selling low-quality items for high tribute prices, they weren't just scamming people. They were cheating the gods, and the gods didn't give refunds. They gave plagues. So if you thought you could hustle your way through the market with a painted corn cob and a charming smile, think again, because in Tenochtitlan, the phrase "buyer beware" came with a very sharp edge. Historians still debate the degree to which these regulations were purely about fairness versus maintaining the central authority's control over trade. This section explores the severe consequences of lying in an Aztec court, where false testimony was considered a sacred violation and a deadly offense. It details the methods of execution for perjury, the idea of suffering the same fate as one caused, and lesser punishments like public beatings or symbolic humiliation, emphasizing the Aztec reverence for truth. If you ever found yourself standing in an Aztec courtroom, surrounded by elders in feathered cloaks, and facing judgment under the piercing gaze of a priest judge, Here's one golden rule. Do not lie. Seriously. Don't embellish, don't misremember, and absolutely don't invent your own version of the truth. Because in the Aztec Empire, false testimony wasn't just unethical, it was deadly. The Aztecs held truth as a sacred principle, not just a courtroom courtesy. Telling the truth meant upholding order, harmony, and divine balance. Lies, on the other hand, corrupted the social structure and offended the gods, especially Tezcatlipoca, the god of night, judgment, and truth. He didn't appreciate your creative storytelling. Court trials depended heavily on witness testimony. There were no security cameras, no forensic labs, just your word against someone else's, and that word carried serious weight. So when you lied in court, you weren't just tipping the scales. You were potentially sending someone to their death or enslavement unjustly. The punishment for perjury, execution, often by strangulation, stoning, or being clubbed to death, depending on the region and the severity of your deceit. If the lie was proven after the trial, and your false words led to someone else's suffering, you'd often be made to suffer the same fate you caused them. It was poetic justice with sharp edges. Even lesser lies came with serious consequences. Public beatings, banishment, or ritual humiliation could follow. You might be painted black, the color of deceit, or shaved bald and paraded through the market with a sign around your neck, reading something like, "Talks too much, tells too little truth." False accusers weren't just punished for lying, they were seen as threats to society itself, willing to manipulate justice, harm others, and risk divine anger for selfish gain. Aztec law wasn't about technicalities, it was about moral clarity, and in their eyes, truth was sacred, binding, and non-negotiable. So, if you ever stood in the plaza, accused of a crime, and thought a small fib might get you off the hook, remember, in the Aztec Empire, the truth could set you free, but a lie, it could bury you. Historians still debate whether this emphasis on truth-telling was unique to the Aztecs or a common feature of many ancient oral societies. This section outlines the three strikes rule in Aztec justice, where repeated offenses, a third crime, invariably led to severe, often ritualistic, executions. It emphasizes the Aztec belief that repeat offenders disrupted cosmic balance and were a threat to social order, leading to their being unpersoned or permanently banished rather than simply imprisoned. The Aztecs believed in second chances, just not very many of them. Their legal system was harsh, but not heartless. A first offense might earn you a warning, a fine, or a good public flogging to help you remember the lesson. A second time, and you'd face something more intense, maybe public humiliation, servitude, or the loss of your possessions. But a third offense, that's when things got serious, like ritual execution serious. To the Aztecs, repeated crimes weren't just a nuisance. They were proof that you had refused to live in balance. And balance, in Aztec worldview, was everything. The crops grew because society worked. The sun rose because people obeyed their roles. So when someone broke the law again and again, they weren't just annoying, they were a threat to cosmic order. Let's say you were a thief. First time, you return the goods. Second time, you're enslaved. Third time, you're skinned slowly in public, with the full backing of the law, and very possibly the neighborhood. Or maybe you lied in court again. The punishment wasn't just harsher than before, it was symbolic. Your repeated dishonesty made you inhuman in the eyes of society, and what happens to those who lose their humanity? They become examples, warnings, cautionary tales. And it wasn't just about physical punishment. Repeat offenders could lose their legal protection entirely. That meant anyone could harm, enslave, or publicly shame you, and you had no legal recourse. You weren't exiled. You weren't imprisoned. You were unpersoned. In some cases, a repeat offender could be permanently banished from the market, the village, or even their own family. Imagine being spiritually erased, not because the gods abandoned you, but because you abandoned the social contract one too many times. To the Aztecs, lawbreakers weren't inherently evil, they were correctable. But repeat offenders were something worse, unwilling to learn. And in a society where justice was public, swift, and divine, the state didn't waste time on those who refused to be rehabilitated. So, if you got caught once, you were lucky. Twice, you were warned. But if you stood in that courtroom a third time, you were already gone. Historians still debate the efficacy of such a rigid three-strike system in a society with no formal correctional facilities. Justice as street theater, the public spectacle of punishment. This section highlights the public and theatrical nature of Aztec punishment, where consequences were displayed openly in community centers to educate and deter. It describes various public shaming tactics and executions, emphasizing that the goal was not just to punish the individual, but to create a lasting ritual of memory for the entire society. In modern justice systems, punishment often happens behind closed doors. Courtrooms, jail cells, private hearings. But in the Aztec Empire, justice was street theater. Punishment wasn't just meant for the person who broke the law. It was designed to educate everyone else. The Aztecs believed that fear and shame were tools just as important as clubs and cactus whips. If someone saw your humiliation, they'd remember it long after the pain faded, and they'd think twice before stealing that tamale. That's why almost all punishments, from flogging to execution, were carried out in the open, usually in the center of the community, the plaza, the marketplace, or outside temples. These were the places where people gathered to trade, pray, and socialize, perfect for teaching lessons in full view of your friends, family, and enemies. Imagine this: you're caught lying or stealing. You're dragged to the plaza. A crowd gathers. Your clothes are torn. Your head might be shaved. You're painted with black soot to mark your shame. And then the punishment begins. A beating, a binding, maybe a good chili smoking in a hut if you're still young and reckless. Children who disrespected elders might be made to carry heavy bundles of wood barefoot across town. Lazy workers could be paraded with signs around their necks. Adulterers could be stoned or strangled before a sea of silent or not so silent onlookers. Public punishment wasn't random cruelty. It was a ritual of memory. The Aztecs understood human psychology. Pain fades, embarrassment echoes, and that echo kept society in line. There were no prison systems, no lifelong incarcerations. The point wasn't to disappear wrongdoers. It was to transform them or destroy them in full view. Even executions were spectacles. A thief might be flayed, not in some dark back room, but in the square where he once sold stolen goods. His punishment became a living parable for every passerby. In Aztec law, privacy was for the innocent. The guilty were meant to be seen, heard, and remembered not just for what they did, but for what happened next. Because in this world, your real sentence wasn't just death or pain. It was becoming the lesson. Historians still debate Whether this emphasis on public spectacle was unique to the Aztecs or a common feature of many ancient, pre-literate societies. Symbolic punishment, the visual language of shame. This section explores the symbolic nature of Aztec punishments, where visual cues like shaved heads, painted bodies, or specific clothing were used to publicly shame offenders. It emphasizes how these symbols conveyed meaning, inverted social status, especially for nobles, and served as enduring visual reminders that crime was a public disruption of sacred order. In the Aztec Empire, punishment wasn't just about what you felt, it was about what you represented. It wasn't enough for you to hurt. You had to be seen, interpreted, and above all, understood. Because justice in Tenochtitlan wasn't just a legal process, it was a performance. And you were the unfortunate star. Let's say you stole something: food, tools, clothing. If it was your first offense, maybe you weren't beaten. Instead, your head was shaved, your body painted with black soot, and you were paraded around in humiliating clothes, torn, oversized tunics, or rags tied in knots that made you look ridiculous. Not physically painful, but symbolically devastating. Or say you lied in court. You might have your lips stained with charcoal to mark your deceit. Everyone would see it. Everyone would know. It didn't matter if you told the truth later. The stain told its own story. Even colors had meaning. Black was associated with deceit and shame. Red might mark a serious offense. Striped or dyed clothing could be reserved for public punishments. The Aztecs understood that the human eye doesn't forget what it's been trained to fear. Noble offenders were treated no differently, in fact, worse. A noble child, caught drunk, might be dressed as a commoner and forced to sweep temple floors, a clear inversion of his status. To an Aztec audience, that image was powerful. This is what happens when the privileged dishonor their role. Even punishment tools were symbolic. Being beaten with cactus spines was not just about the pain. It reflected the natural world's judgment. Carrying heavy bundles of firewood symbolized the burden of guilt. A shaved head didn't just look odd. It meant you'd been stripped of social dignity. The message: crime wasn't a private mistake. It was a public rupture, a disruption in the sacred flow of order. And to heal it, society needed not just consequences, but images that endured, living reminders that law and morality were deeply intertwined. In short, Aztec punishment was a play, a visual story designed to be retold through gossip, song, and frightened memory. You weren't just a criminal, you were now a symbol. Historians still debate the true psychological impact of these symbolic displays on the Aztec populace. This section explains the absence of prisons in Aztec society, attributing it to their belief in immediate, public, and often permanent consequences rather than long-term incarceration. It details how offenders were either reabsorbed into society, enslaved, or removed entirely, executed, and highlights the cultural reliance on visibility and immediacy for deterrence rather than hidden confinement. In most societies, punishment often ends behind bars. Time served, walls built, a sentence measured in months or years. But in the Aztec Empire, there were no prisons. Why? Because the Aztecs didn't believe in storing problems. They solved them quickly, publicly, and very often, permanently. To the Aztec mind, punishment wasn't about removing someone from society. It was about returning them to order, or removing them from the world altogether. There was no need to feed a prisoner, build a jail, or fund a guard system. Time wasn't the consequence. Shame, pain, or death was. If you stole, you might be enslaved and forced to work off your crime, but you didn't disappear. You remained in society as a cautionary example. If you lied, you wore the symbols of deceit on your body. If you committed a serious offense, the punishment came swiftly, with the community watching and the gods invoked. And if you couldn't be corrected, if you were a repeat offender, a danger to others, or simply defiant, then your story ended not behind a door with iron bars, but in the marketplace, the plaza, or the temple steps, with no need for parole. Even noble prisoners, such as captured enemy rulers or high-ranking criminals, weren't jailed. They were housed temporarily in ritual captivity, treated according to status until their scheduled execution or sacrifice. Their time wasn't served, it was counted down. There were, however, small holding rooms, not prisons, but places to detain someone briefly before their punishment. These were sparse, guarded by warriors, and not used for rehabilitation. You weren't sent there to change, you were sent there to wait. This system worked because Aztec law relied on immediacy and visibility. Delayed punishment weakened its impact. Invisible punishment, like imprisonment, robbed society of the lesson, and in Aztec eyes, the lesson was the most important part. So while other civilizations built towers to hide their criminals, the Aztecs built rituals to remind you, break the order, and the consequences will be swift, public, and unforgettable. Because in this empire, they didn't need bars, they had balance. Historians still debate the practicalities of maintaining order in a large empire without a dedicated prison system. This final section summarizes the Aztec legal system's reliance on remembrance through fear and shame rather than rehabilitation. It explains how every punishment was designed to etch the crime into collective memory, making society self-regulating. It concludes by highlighting the system's effectiveness in maintaining order and its lasting impact on those who witnessed or experienced it. By now, you've probably noticed the Aztec Empire didn't believe in second chances for long. Their punishments were swift, symbolic, and often painful, and that was exactly the point. Because to the Aztecs, the purpose of justice wasn't rehabilitation. It was remembrance. Every punishment, whether it was a chili smoke sauna, a cactus whipping, or being flayed in the plaza, was designed to etch the crime into collective memory for the offender, for the bystanders, for the entire community. A culture without prisons relied on something much stronger: fear, shame, and the kind of storytelling that starts with, "You'll never believe what I saw in the marketplace today." And that's what made the Aztec legal system so effective and so terrifying. It forced people to remember, because if you didn't, you might not live long enough to forget. The entire society was wired for moral clarity. Children were taught early that wrongdoing brought not only pain, but spectacle. Adults knew that crime wasn't just a personal failure, it was a cosmic imbalance. The gods didn't want lengthy court cases, they wanted action, and the empire delivered. But here's the twist. For all its brutality, the system worked, at least for them. Social order was maintained. Markets ran smoothly, children were respectful, priests weren't pickpocketed during ceremonies, and if you ever thought about breaking a rule, all it took was one glance at the guy with the shaved head and soot-smeared face limping past you, and suddenly you remembered the rules quite clearly. The Aztecs didn't just punish, they performed morality. Every crime was an opportunity for education. every consequence was theater. You learned not by reading a scroll, but by witnessing a punishment you never wanted to experience yourself. And if you couldn't learn, well, the system had room for that too. In a society without long-term prisons, non-learners were recycled into warnings. You either remembered the rules, or you didn't survive long enough to break them again. That was Aztec justice. Swift, symbolic, and unforgettable in all the ways that mattered. Historians still debate whether this system, while seemingly effective, also stifled individual freedom and creativity. Slow down, soften your vocabulary, lengthen your sentences, reassure your audience, blur out the final image, and end with a soft whisper. As our journey through the echoes of Aztec justice comes to a close, allow your mind to drift back from the harsh plazas and the burning chilies. Picture the quiet moments after the sun has set over those ancient pyramids, when the last whispers of the market have faded into the twilight. Imagine the vast, starry sky above Tenochtitlan, an infinite canvas against which their strict yet strangely coherent world unfolded. The fear that kept society aligned, the shame that imprinted lessons upon souls, all of it was part of a grand, intricate design, ensuring that life, however brutal, continued to flow in balance with the cosmos. It was a world where every action had a profound ripple, where consequence was etched not just into bodies, but into the very memory of the community. As you close your eyes tonight, consider the quiet power of these ancient stories, lessons whispered across centuries, reminding us how deeply woven the threads of order and belief once were.